Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I've got to say, I'm trying to do some mental readjustment. I was just in Mississauga teaching first-year playwriting students contemporary theater, so I'm rejiggering my brain for a second. So, thank you so much for coming. I remember when I was 10 years old, and I don't know if you can remember being 10 and what went through your head, but specifically, I remember being 10 years old, and I was sitting up on the top bunk of one of these, camp bunks. You know what I mean? That plastic kind of thing. You've got the wood around you, and the wind's coming in. And I remember feeling like someone was about to murder me. And there's a specific reason for that. The leader of the group that had taken us out to that particular cabin in the middle of the woods for the first time in my entire life decided that would be an excellent time to tell us a true story about a character who had escaped a prison called the Weber and had brutally murdered a family. And I remember having two thoughts in that moment as I pressed as far into the darkness of that wooden corner as I possibly could. I remember thinking, first of all, I'm not going to get through this night. And then I remember thinking, but if I do get through this night, I'm going to think a great deal about the fact that this man's words in story form managed to make me afraid. And I mention this story to you because it was the first moment I really started to think about the power of a story. That so much could happen to me, and I could rethink so many and feel so many feelings, and I still remember, by the way, that entire story. I have never forgotten that story. And I remember starting to think, how does this work? And it really is that moment that in some ways was kind of a trajectory for me in my life. From that point on, I thought a lot about stories. And I thought a lot about why certain stories worked in certain contexts and how one could get good at doing those stories. And even now professionally, in my own, I'm now back into academia after a number of years, sometimes teaching, also for full-time pastoring, full-time theater artist at one point in my life. As I got back into it, it still drives me forward. How do people change people with stories? Now, because I am now an academic, I must begin with a working definition for you, because I lose my membership card otherwise. So let me give you, though, a little bit of definition for story before I talk to you a little about 4 moments that began to shape my thinking about stories. So let me define storytelling for you. 3 parts, really. So I call it the performative use of an event in order to more effectively reach a communication goal. So notice the 3 parts. First of all, there's the performative use. Performance, and which is an entire field, by the way, in its own right now, performance is really public doing of some kind. So it suggests, first of all, that you're doing something in front of people, and it also suggests there's a kind of skillfulness involved in it. One might say, sure, yes, everyone can tell a story, but not everyone can tell a story well. And so there's skill involved. There's also the idea, the use, I call it an event. So an event is anytime you have key connected happenings that take place over time. So if something happens, a bunch of happenings occur, and that takes place over time, you're now involved in a story. So in some ways, that actually broadens what a story can be. If you're focusing on these events, you're thinking about how it takes place in time, you're now involved in some sort of storytelling. So an entire 3 hours could be a story, it could be 30 seconds, so it's a matter of putting together an event orientation. And then finally, and this is very important to what I want to talk about today, in order to more effectively reach a communication goal. The assumption here is that you have a reason you're in this particular workshop, and that you see that stories can do some kind of work for you. So I want to think about this idea of work, and specifically the work of change. Stories as a change agent, which is really what I'm doing my doctoral thesis, really on this idea of what I would call it is persuasively inflected messages and in theatrical forms. But it's really about stories and change. So I do want to encourage you, I always think it's important, especially in a workshop situation, for you to process these things through your own context. Again, if you're here, I assume that you are somehow involved in the profession of speaking on a regular basis. So if you can start to think through some practical areas, and maybe we can even have a conversation later on about this. So what might be an event that you find yourself focusing on, that you might want to tell a story about, and what is your goal? Because that's one of the big ideas. It's called 4 stories for a reason. It's because the kind of story you tell should be very much connected with the kind of goal that you have for it. So I'm going to talk about upsides and downsides of certain stories, but really it's so much based on not only context, but the kinds of things you hope to achieve. So I'll come back to this in a second. If you have pressing questions at some point in time, I will try to give you some time, but I actually am quite comfortable with that. I actually prefer, if you jump in, and that's totally cool with me, so feel free to do that at any point. So let me give you 4 moments where I really began to think about storytelling and change and how the two of them intersected. So the first was I was thinking it was about 8 years ago. I was teaching a class on advanced public speaking at a university some of you might know. It was formerly Atlantic Baptist University, now it's Crandall University. It's on the East Coast in Moncton. Anyone know this? Okay, good, some nodding, thank you. Polite nodding, but it's good, at least I feel like you know where that is. So I was teaching, it was a very small but amazing class because it had some really great young emerging leaders in that classroom. And we were doing advanced public speaking, and we focused on 2 texts. One was a text called Persuasion, which is a very intense academic book on the idea of persuasion. It had a lot of mathematical formulas. They hated me for that. Good stuff, but it was heavy. And then the other one was about storytelling, which seemed more light. It was more practitioner-oriented, but we used both. So not surprisingly, in that class, they did a lot of speaking. And I always asked one question every single time after each one of them gave their speeches. Someone would finish, they would sit down, I would turn to the classroom, I would say, what's the first thing you remember this person saying? I'm guessing you might be able to answer that. What do you think the first thing they remembered almost every single time was? No, actually not the first word. Interesting. No, although that would be sad, but not true. Fortunately not true. Yeah. Sorry? No, actually it wasn't. It's actually the hint's in the title. There you go. This happened over and over and over again, and the reason it's meaningful is because sometimes their story was the beginning of their 7, 12-minute speech. Sometimes it was at 10 minutes. It was still the first thing they remembered. Over and over and over again, and I never forgot that. I thought, okay, that is very critical. If the memory says to itself, focus on the story, and then it cuts everything out before that, if you don't think about that, then you could find yourself in some trouble if you do public speaking on a regular basis. Here's the second event that happened, or it was kind of an ongoing happening. At the same time as I was as an adjunct teaching theater and communications, I was also a full-time church planter, and did a church that was oriented to church that people who didn't do church. So we had a lot of young adults. Average age was about 26, and most of them had little to no church background. Really strong response, but one of the things that we would have constantly in almost every service was, not surprisingly, a testimony time. Why? Because we found that, after me, of course, the single most important, actually not including me, it includes me, the single most frequent moment that people would explain helped people experience God was a testimony, someone's testimony. And most of these people, again, had no church background, they were not public speakers, they would just share their story is what we would say. And people always responded well to that, except on a very few occasions. So for me, I'm equally as interested in failure as I am success. So I would ask myself, why didn't that work? You could feel the room closing in sometimes. You could feel people sort of shutting things down. Well, here were the two things that were always part of those moments that people shut down. Number one, it was always a person who had an extensive church background. So I took note of that. Also, it was a person, because I think of their extensive church background, who felt the need to teach something to people as they were telling their story. And the second they went into teaching mode, you could feel the room go, oh, I thought you were talking about something real. Now you're teaching me something. And so I took note of that moment. I took note of the fact that in a story of that kind, if someone thinks that now you are going to teach them something, people shut you down. Very different experience I want to talk about now. I don't know if you can see this. This is a little tiny set of puppets. It's a friend of mine who did a one-man show called Grandma Noticed Tiger, won a bunch of awards for it. So my friend Chris we both went to university together, and he, for a very long period of time, did very committed, earnest Marxist theater. Sometimes interesting, mostly very badly received. He got tired of doing that after a certain point of time and thought, I like puppetry better. Now, here's what was interesting about that. So he started to do what he called found object puppetry, and here's your little moment of learning about theater. Found object puppetry is using a regular item or a recognizable item as the form of your puppet. So I might go, this might be my main character, and we come across, and maybe I have a coffee mug to represent the police officer, and so it's somehow connected to your own experience. Some of you might recognize, well, probably not from here, the Sesame Street figurines from your children's lives, and he was using those. So it seems they did sort of practical magic. It was amazing and wonderful and enjoyable. But here was what surprised me about this kind of storytelling. It began to infect you, the story. You were like, oh, it's a puppet. Oh, isn't this fun? Oh, isn't that clever? And then you found yourself deeper and deeper involved with the little figurine. And by the end, when the protagonist, whose name was Hiro, H-I-R-O, was set in Japan, literally paved Grandma Noda's paradise to put up a parking lot, you found yourself deeply moved, not only because of the story, but thinking about your own sense of consumption in your life. One of the greatest reviews I've ever read like this about this show. She said, and at the end, when the character walked away, Hiro walked away with a dark heart. And the reviewer said, and from the darkness of the audience, a small voice spoke out, with a dark heart. And I thought, you've just won. The audience member is literally repeating the key message you were trying to convey. They were so deeply moved by this seeming puppet theater that they were repeating it back out loud. They got it. Now here's the last example, and it's the craziest one of all. I was involved in stage managing a show called Utopia, which was set on monkey bars in a very dark space on a very hot night, and computer effects. It was kind of a nightmare to work on. But it wasn't only a nightmare because of that, but because the writer of the play had a very complex, interesting show about post-apocalyptic experiences and how people get trapped in a computer. Anyway, it's very complicated, and then he decided to make it more complicated. He decided to take the story and cut out all the bits that would help you be able to follow it on purpose. And it ran for about an hour and a half, and not surprisingly, audiences hated it. I mean, the visceral hatred by the end of it was just unbelievable. I'd never seen anything like it. But this is the thing I noted. People would tell me how much they hated it and how much they disliked it, and then they would show up a week later, and I remember one professor cornered me in an elevator, almost pushed me up against the wall and said, I am still thinking about that stupid show. And I went, wow. You didn't feel like you understood the show, you hated the show, but you're still thinking about it. And And I said to myself, Scott, you must think deeply about what's happening right now. Why is this person still thinking about this show? So, this sort of is a foreshadow to some of the key points I want to look at with the 4 stories. I want to look at style in 2 particular ways. And when I say style, I mean sort of the fundamental approach that you are taking to the storytelling. I'm going to use 4 examples. This isn't to suggest that there's only 4 stories, nor that they don't overlap some, but I want to sort of feature as prototypes 4 styles of shows. And I want to examine why some of them create more attention, and some of them will create more resistance, especially if your message is change-oriented, because some styles clearly do that depending on the situation the person finds themselves in. The other is that some styles tend to be more or less memorable and durable, which is important to know. What stays with people? I don't know, I think a lot of you preach on a regular basis. I don't know at the point that you had this same thought. There was a moment in my life where I was preaching every single week, and you're doing, let's say you're doing 45 sermons a year, and you begin to say to yourself, like, how much are they actually keeping with them of these 45? And you start to say, what is my real target? What would I be happy with? 6, 7 sermons that they still remember at the end? So I did find myself thinking, and so when I read this book on persuasion, the idea of what they call decay, it's the idea of how long do things stick with them and why do certain ideas stick with people in stories. So we're going to look at that some as well. And then I do want to think about the idea of change. So to define change here, I'm looking specifically at the idea of an attitude. That's a global way of thinking about a particular idea or a person or a concept. And the reason that we look at attitudes from the literature is because the best predictor of what people will or will not do is their attitude towards something. It's not 100%, but it's the best predictor. So in other words, if you want to change someone, you want to change their behavior in some way, the best thing to do, the literature all says this, is to target their attitude and begin to get into that. But it's important to understand that change is not one thing. When we talk about changing attitudes, we're actually talking about 2 different kinds of ideas. One is we're changing in what's called valence. That is the fundamental feeling someone has about a particular idea. So let's say I'm doing a story about prayer. And I want people, and I've got someone who's like, I don't think prayer really does anything at all. I want to change their attitude where they think prayer actually matters. It actually does something positive in their lives. What I'm saying is I'm trying to change their valence. I'm trying to change their fundamental perspective. But it's important to actually know that the second one is the most common change that most people actually are involved in, and that is a change in intensity. Many people already believe the thing you're trying to talk about. The issue isn't that they believe it or not, it's how deeply they believe it. It's, does this thing matter? I could, if you want to later on, I can talk to you about some of the persuasive theory that talks about the idea of that people actually have a little bit of a priority list that they have. And they say to themselves, yeah, I agree with this. How pressing is this thing for me in my life, this idea? And if it's pressing, then the attitude matters. If it's not pressing, it doesn't really matter, their attitude at all. So in many cases, we talk about preaching to the choir. What you're actually trying to do is rev that choir up to say, yeah, I know you think this, but it really matters. So that's really important to decide what kind of change that you are speaking to. Are you trying to change the direction of that attitude? Are you trying to change the intensity of that attitude? Because your style will be more or less successful depending on what you're trying to do there. Okay, so far, how are we doing so far? Any questions about, anyone wondering about any of this? You're not sure? Are you everyone following so far what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's start to get into some of the styles. And then I'll sort of stop at the end of each one just to chat about that. All right, so I want to encourage you to think about who you're trying to change and in what way. So the first one is probably the kind of storytelling you are most familiar with. We'll call it the didactic style. It's oriented towards teaching. Now, I've tried to use examples from performance and the entertainment world to kind of give you a sense of how this is used in various places. And I want to say that each of these styles can be effective. So I was trying to think of who do I know who is probably more effective at using the didactic style of storytelling than anyone, and I have John Oliver. How many of you know who John Oliver is and are willing to admit that? Okay, good, thank you. My wife made me promise to say, I don't in any way endorse John Oliver, nor some of the language or themes that he approaches, nor do I ever laugh at all. I find it deeply offensive sometimes. So with that disclaimer out of the mind, and you can tell Debbie I said that, John Oliver is brilliant at telling stories where you learn things and are changed by that. I know that because I now care deeply about Puerto Rican debt relief. I never in my life even knew there was such a thing as Puerto Rican debt relief until I watched John Oliver. And it's important to know if I didn't actually think that if I hadn't enjoyed John Oliver before this, I would never have sat through that program. There's no way. But I thought, it'll probably be funny. Which is actually something important to remember. Suddenly at the end, I'm like, you're right, John. You've told me a story of the history of debt relief of Puerto Rico, and how that the Congress has made a bunch of mistakes and how they should get involved. And maybe I will write someone if I was American. Maybe I would write someone. And I went, wow, what just happened there? Why am I doing this? So unpacking a little bit about what this is about. So what's the goal here? The goal here, when didactic storytelling at its best, is about targeting listeners' ignorance. The assumption here is these people need to change, and if they just knew the right things, they probably would change, if they just had good information. This is actually, this first line seems obvious, but it's important you realize that, because often I sit in churches for decades and decades, and I thought, all of these people already know these things. This story's not effective. They know this already. It's the same thing with certain biblical stories. Because they're so familiar with the story already, you're not getting anywhere. You've got to begin with the idea of something that someone hasn't heard before. The playwright who wrote Raisin in the Sun, I just was exposed to a brand new play by her. And so most weeks I read, so I'm thinking about the students, I'm like, okay, let me slog through this. But this week I was like excited because I was like, I don't know this play at all. What's going to happen? And the students were surprised that I was like, I couldn't believe at the end that this happened because I was excited about something new. The idea is to get people excited about something they have never been exposed to before because there's a part of your brain that actually likes new things. It actually will produce chemicals for you if you give them happy, important, interesting new things. The big focus here is featuring solid new facts that they've never been exposed to. This is why in this kind of story you have to do your research. You have to know things and you have to be able to say, establish for them to believe that you actually know what you're talking about when you tell that story. The idea here is that you're aiming for particular application. I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to walk away from this story doing the following thing. This is why at one point I gave this talk, and I had Jon Stewart up, and who was actually his mentor, John Oliver's mentor. But I realized that Jon Stewart was not very good at this last point. He could get people revved up, but he didn't give them something to do. And John Oliver at a certain point went, wait a minute, I need to give them something real. Donate to this, or send this message in, or talk to this person, because the point of this story is to get people to actually do real things. So, you actually might be, I was trying to think biblically through some examples of stories, especially related to Jesus and stories that Jesus told. You actually might be surprised that Jesus rarely actually delved into this style of story. Like, about here's new information that you have never heard before. It's facts. Let me give you some facts. But there is one interesting example, and it came out of a question. Of course, there's a man that walks up and says, how do I have eternal life? Jesus says, well, what do you think? The man answers the question. He said, there you go, and walks away. And he goes, well, who is my neighbor? That's the famous. So he asks a very specific question. I don't know something, or he pretended not to know. I don't know something. So Jesus gives him a factual story with new facts he never heard. The new facts were, these religious people, they cross the streets. You know what, Samaritans, they help people out sometimes. And at the end, he says, remember how the end, he goes, who was the man's neighbor? He's going, did you get the information? The man hesitantly goes, it's the one who helped him out. Because he couldn't say Samaritan, but he had to answer, it's the one who helped him out. And then remember what Jesus says? Go and do likewise. Particular application. So Jesus did tell this kind of story. We don't know if it's successful in this case or not, but clearly it was recorded and it was worthwhile. Now, does this style work? The answer is sometimes, but not as much as you probably think. Which is probably kind of a big deal since many of us, when we're preaching, trade in factual-based stories. So, first of all, it can be very helpful if it is somehow considered relevant to someone's life. I saw a show recently. I can't talk about this because I'm now on tape and I'm not allowed to disclose that, but let's just say I saw a show recently, and it was interesting because people were very engaged with the issue the show was doing. It was very factually based, and so they listened carefully because it was part of their own lives. Because they had children and grandparents and parents, they paid attention. People who didn't really have those relationships, when I was looking at the data, didn't care at all and didn't pay attention. Because the show was about that. It was about generations. If you didn't feel you're involved in that, gone. So if you tell this story, you better be really sure you convince people that it actually matters to them in their lives, or they just don't pay attention. Because they know people are very, very quick to know, oh, you're trying to teach me something right now. I mean, they sniff it immediately. So you've got to promise some sort of reward is coming for listening to this kind of story. Second thing that you might, and this is the big surprise, this kind of story entrenches pre-existing views. That includes if they disagree with you. As a matter of fact, if you tell them a story that is counter to what they think is true, you know what they actually do? They spend the whole story figuring out how you are wrong. You actually train them to argue back better against your arguments. That is something that's very sobering. This kind of story does not change the mind of someone who is on the other side. It just entrenches. If they agree with your story, they go, yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, if you wonder about this, just watch the American political system and how that worked in the last election. People told stories, and people remained entrenched in what they already believed and went deeper with that. So, this is why knowing your audience is important. You can't introduce something that's fundamentally different to someone unless it's really relevant and they feel a pressing need to have that question answered. Last thing is, you also should know that outsiders' truth can foster passivity. Most of you have given children stories before, I assume, in front of children, often in front of people watching you tell stories in front of children. And if you ask the question, any question at all, really, you know what the answer is going to be. It's going to be, that's right, exactly. Because these kids have learned you're telling a certain kind of story, and most of the time the answer to that story is Jesus. And you've actually trained them to learn to pretend to listen to you when they're not actually listening. And you should know that about this kind of story. I mean, I'm in this danger in my own experience right now, that if you already think you know that you can tune out and you just learn how to nod at the right moments, but you actually tune out the whole thing if they smell teaching in this. Okay, let me stop for a second and ask you if you have any maybe particular questions or maybe particular experiences that you want to share in this particular kind of story, which is probably the story that many of you are most used to. Questions or comments or thinking? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, they absolutely are. And he's a perfect example of someone who succeeds. So, yeah, oh, yes, you want to? Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah. So she was saying that she listens to a lot of Tim Keller sermons, who's the pastor of, what's the Presbyterian? Redeemer, yeah, out of New York. Fantastic speaker. Deep insight, lots of information. So why does this work? Well, let me offer you some my thought. One is Tim Keller is very aware of the actual real life experiences and needs of the people in that congregation. As a matter of fact, I've heard him talk about how he's built that for professionals, and he uses the idea of relevancy a lot. So he isn't just going, here are some facts that you should know. He's going, here's some facts that you need in your life. Number one. Number two is he's traded in his credibility. Why did I listen to John Oliver talk about Puerto Rico? Because I've learned from things from him in the past, and because he makes me laugh. So he's earned the right to talk about something I don't know about anymore. So Tim Keller trades in this fact that I will give you something that will be worthwhile in the end. And so he's earned credibility that way. So I think absolutely that's one of the reasons why he's so successful, and he builds it around people who feel they're going to church to learn something that will help them very specifically in their lives. So that's the kind of audience that wants to go in with that. That would be my response. Any other questions or comments about this particular approach or style? Okay. You didn't give me enough time to drink more coffee. Okay, so number two. This is actually the one in the literature that gets most studied, especially film and television and books. Identification. The classic example is The Lord of the Rings. Do we all know The Lord of the Rings? Is there anyone not familiar with the... Okay. So you know The Lord of the Rings. The true story of The Lord of the Rings is about two hobbits. Little hobbits in a very small little community that don't get involved with life, and they're sort of tucked away, and they get induced to go on this long journey in this giant world, and in the end they find out that their choices have mattered fundamentally to the world, and that they're called to sacrifice the stable, safe existence for the greater good. This is the most popular idea of what a story does. The most popular idea of what a story does is that it invites listeners to follow the journey of compelling characters. Now, I want you to notice two parts of this. What really people are supposed to follow is the idea of journey. You're telling a journey about how a person went from here to here. I talked about ghost stories. These are the first stories I examined as a child. But I realized it's all about how well you make this journey, how well you build from here to this moment, because people are hardwired for that kind of story. They're hardwired to go, what happens next, what happens next, what happens next, what happens next, and how does this pay off? And so we instantly, as a matter of fact, sometimes when you have stories that really aren't like this at all, people still try to impose that kind of story on top of it. They think in that sort of linear narrative kind of way. So it's important to understand that what you're really talking about is a journey when you tell this story. How do you go from here to here? The other thing is the idea of compelling characters. There's two reasons why people find a character compelling. Number one is because it looks like them in some way. You might be interested in knowing that the most compelling reason to believe someone without factual evidence is because you find them likable. And when you really get into the research on why does someone find someone likable, because they remind them of themselves. So when you tell stories, you've got to have these characters. That's why the story of The Lord of the Rings is not really about any lords, and it's not really about, for instance, Aragorn, right? Who's the big heroic guy. I mean, his story's in there, but it's really about these guys, because everyone gets these guys. It's also important to know that compelling also means that somehow that you are interesting, but also it also means the storyteller. People actually don't disconnect. Because I come from this acting background, it used to be that actors thought, I become this brand new character, and so when I walk onto stage, you don't see me anymore, you see only the character. And it turns out audiences, they don't really nuance between these things. I was doing research where a guy was like, I don't like that guy in movies, so I won't go to his movies. You mean you don't like the character he plays? Yeah, it's all the same thing. Oh, okay. So it turns out that people actually they blur the line between you and the stories you tell. So this means you must be compelling as well. There must be something about you that goes, oh, I really want to listen to this person. And so you've got to work that out. That's why a person can kill a story, a great story, because they aren't very good at telling stories, and because they're kind of, you don't want to listen to that person, they're not interesting, or they drone on, and they have a certain... So you've got to, if you're telling this kind of story, part of it is to say, there's something dynamic about that. But it's not really about the characters, it's about the journey. Because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to aim a move, an attitude like the characters. In these stories, what happens is the character starts off thinking in one way, and by the end of it, they change the way they think. And the idea here is that you follow the characters, but you also follow the way their minds move. You start to go, yeah, I see this. And it turns out, the literature says this actually works. That, as a matter of fact, there's times that you can follow someone that you can actually have an opinion that you go in with something, you see a character that you find compelling, you follow them, and you can actually change in a way similar to the way the character changes. So actually, this is terribly effective, although there is a caveat with that. Of course, the classic example of this story, and the first time I saw it, just incredibly how powerful the stories that Jesus told could be today. I was with a young woman, and she was a hardcore atheist. And she hated church, and she hated church things. And she'd been sent to this Christian school because she had been kicked out of all the other schools. And she was just antagonistic to the core. And one time, her very wealthy father invited a bunch of us over, and we went over to her house. And we were sitting in her house, and she said something that made me think about the prodigal son. And I said, well, that reminds me of this guy, the prodigal son, and blank. I went, she doesn't know what this story is. So I start to tell the story. And I tell it, I keep telling it, This girl who was hardcore, just like this the whole time, she's like crying at the end of the story of the woman returning. I think, holy smokes, this is a great story. This is a great story, and it's the story that Jesus told because she got the guy. She got the guy who walked away. She got his journey, and deep inside, she wanted to be the one. She wanted to come back. And I saw that it moved her and changed her, that she followed that. And I never forgot that. I never forgot that when people say, telling Bible stories is a problem with people who go to church. They're the ones, I hate telling stories like that to them because they already, I know the story and I know the commentaries. But brand new people, those are amazing stories. They're powerful stories. Something to keep in mind. So, upside and downside. One is people are less resistant to a story like this. People fundamentally like this kind of narrative story. So they go, okay, you're going to tell me a story. And they know it's not teaching anymore, so they listen. And they don't put up their brakes like, ooh, what are you trying to do to me right now? They're like, I'm going to ride this thing. It's actually the part of the problem. The problem comes with the ride part of things. The problem can become in affirmation versus action. What do I mean by this? The more unrelatable that character is to them personally in their lives, the more heroic or epic or amazing they are, the more people will go, yeah, that person's amazing, but they don't see themselves in it at all. As a matter of fact, this is sometimes the challenge. If you're telling stories about Jesus, this is actually sometimes your challenge. People hear Jesus, they go, right, well, he was pretty awesome, not me. And so they hear the story, they like the story, and they go, that's great. That's totally not me. And so in some cases, you can actually have the opposite effect that you want to achieve. It's not that they disagree with what you're trying to say. They just go, that's not my story. So you want to keep that in mind. As a matter of fact, sometimes it used to be when you would do drama in a church, they wanted this really sanitized, like everything's perfect, and they were really, really bad. And then by the end of that 5-minute skit, they are really, really good. And everything has changed in their lives. And I would constantly have to fight, this was a few decades ago, with pastors to say, this isn't going to work, right? Oh no, it's going to work. Because I remember once I went on, fill in the blank, one story they saw one time, we're like, oh yeah, I totally bought into that. And I said, okay. But the problem is people don't believe that story. They don't think it's true. They like the story. They go, yay, good wins in the end, but they're unmoved by it. It's not real for them. So that's something you want to keep in mind. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that, does it last? Here's the problem with this kind of story. It can go away quickly if there is no real trouble with following it. Listening to a story in some ways is a very passive activity. Think about it. What you do is you sit back and listen to the story. It's kind of a brain operation where your brain sits back and goes, I'll settle in, I'll go along with this ride, and then I'll move on. I remember, my wife is now here, so I have to be careful, but we went to this musical Once. Does anyone know the musical Once? Anyone know that? Okay. You might know the music. It's beautiful music. And we went to the musical, and we went on Valentine's Day, and it's beautiful, and it's this love story. At the end, I'm crying. I don't know if Debbie's crying, but I'm crying. I'm like, I love you so much. And it's like, oh, this is a great thing. And then the next, a week later, I'm like, I went to this musical, and I'm like, what was that about again? I'm like, wait a minute. I know I was crying at the end of that, but now I don't at all remember for the life of me why that worked. I don't know why I was crying, and that was a cautionary tale for me, because it was so easy to slip into it that it was very easy to slip back out. That's a big thing in the next two examples. If it's easy to slip in, it's easy to slip out. Any quick questions about this one? This is probably more self-evident. So let me get to the third one, which is a very different kind of story. This is the transportation story. Now we're in an Anglican building. Anyone know what this is? What's that? That's right, exactly. It's a labyrinth. So for those of you who don't know, the idea of a labyrinth is it's a kind of meditative space. It's like a maze that you go in, and at certain sections in that labyrinth, depending on how you do this, you stop and you involve yourself in certain kinds of reflections or meditations, and you go in, you walk through in, and then you walk back out. And it's this kind of journey where you go somewhere else. As I've been reading the literature, I thought a lot about this kind of idea, because a labyrinth takes you into a different place. I did this show I was with a Christian theater company that we ran, and we took people through this church, and we sort of took Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know if you know that story or not. And we built stations where they would reflect on a single question but do something physically. So we put all this recyclable garbage, and we had people sit in it, and there was a little message that said, reflect on the garbage that you sit in your life. Or we had them walk into a place with scary music, and then and inside the bag is your biggest fear. What did you think was there? And then we had a makeup where you paint yourself as you really see yourself. And there was a moment where they washed stuff away, and then there was a moment they sat down with Jesus, and we took people through. We didn't know how this would go. They had 5 minutes in each of these spaces. People at the end of this, generally speaking, were crying at the end, weeping. One-sentence messages. The story was almost completely nonverbal. It was mostly physical. But they were deeply moved by their encounter with this kind of story. Well, why is that? Well, the idea here is that a transportation story pulls listeners into a new-ish world. I say new-ish because if it's completely beyond their understanding, and I've certainly been involved in certain theater shows where people are like, I have no idea what this is right now, and then they just are scared, and so they won't involve. But if it's not scary, you say, we're going to go somewhere brand new, somewhere you've never been before. As a matter of fact, if you were to go to Universal Studios and you were to go to the Harry Potter thing that they have now, it's kind of like you walk through this is a kind of story that is physical in that way. The whole goal here is to do a deeply sensory, physical, and social kind of story. You want a story where people can feel the space. They can feel how people connect and talk to each other and engage with each other. Sometimes that's verbal. You might also expand your notion of a story to be like that show I was saying. It's a story where people literally walk through the space through different events. The idea here is that you're actually deliberately trying to take someone other than the place they are most of the time. Why is that? Because part of the reason that people resist change is because they are just trying to survive. And when you're in survival mode, you do not experiment. You don't experiment at all. You stick with what you know and you stay with that. I'm writing a chapter in a book about prototypes. And it turns out people are quite open to experimenting with new prototypes unless they really need something, and then they don't experiment. So if you're in a moment of immediacy in your life, you stick with what you know. So the point of this is to say, you know what, let's not think about the pressing things you have in your life right now. Let's go somewhere else. And in that moment of being somewhere else, they can have the calmness and relaxation to begin to reflect about a different way, a different approach to things. I often will go to movies. It's my favorite place to go to meet God. One of it is because I think it's a very dark place that I can't see anything else except the screen. So it blocks out all the other sensory things that are going on. It feels like not my regular life. And because sometimes it will induce me to just think about somewhere else. And it tricks me into thinking about that idea. There's a movie, confession, it's called Arrival. It was just nominated. It was about the aliens. I actually had the most amazing encounter I've had with God in the last 6 months in that movie. Because I was thinking about this being that comes in that I've never encountered before, who speaks in a brand new way and slowly woos me into meeting and speaking with it. And God started to use that other space. So they told a story, they told me to go somewhere else, and then I began to think about things that actually mattered to me in my life. And I was moved, and it hasn't left me since then. Well, why is that? Upside and downside here. One is, novelty is rewarding. There's a part of your brain that doesn't want to change at all. It's like, let's stick with what we know. But thank goodness God has given us a part of our brain that says something really new pays off. We've talked about that chemically. So the puppet show I talked about, people liked, I've never seen this before. And they did all kinds of, it was almost like magic tricks where people go, that's great. And so you're brought into that world. There's also the idea that in this situation, it's called, I think of it as middle play. When you go in the transportation world, you're invited to play with something. Sometimes it's ideas. In the show we talked about, it's with your body. You get involved in doing something. You're no longer that passive person that listened to the story. You're someone who's actively involved in being in that world. And people don't selectively engage in activity or not. If you're engaged, you're engaged. That's the interesting trick here. If you can get them engaged in any way, that's why laughter, I don't know if you've ever noticed that when people at a funeral, you tell a story that's funny, people laugh and then they go deeper into the grief because their brains have said, pay attention now. So part of it is learning to play, and then you get involved in a more interesting way. Now, at one point I talked about ambiguous takeaway. I'm not ready to authoritatively say that I know for sure, but there's very strong evidence to suggest that people don't leave behind the messages they learn when they play in their minds in these stories. That it sticks with them because they were part of doing something. And because they enjoyed the experience and they were part of doing something, and because there was this deep sense of like a different place, they want to keep going back to that place and return to that kind of place. So that's something worth thinking about. Now, this is a harder story to tell, but it's not impossible. If you think about, I actually was thinking about stories that Jesus told without words, like, remember when Jesus would heal someone and he would put mud in their eyes and he would spit? And so here's my different take. I know some people say, well, it's because, some people say the chemical properties, or some people go, well, I actually think it's because there's something about body contact there. It was getting people's bodies involved and touching and sensory. There was an interaction that was happening here that people stand up and walk. It's because you're doing something. Because when people walk away from your story, you want them to keep doing things. If you have spent the whole time in your story telling them, don't do anything, but now, afterwards, I want you to do something, you've mistrained them. So you want them to get in the habit of that kind of doing. Okay, any questions or comments or thoughts about that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. Yeah. And yes, and that's part of that sense of like what happens when people do right? Do people want to simply escape and never go? I think actually this happens in church sometimes, right? They have such a powerful experience in a church that they just want to be in church and they survive. They'll get back into church and they go back into their regular lives and like, oh, like this. Let me go back into this kind of nice, safe, cozy kind of space. So I think you're right. And that is where that kind of middle sense, I think you've got to learn how to navigate where your real life will encounter this kind of idea. Yeah, that's a great, I'm glad you brought that up, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, some people actually conflate the two ideas, and I actually think, which actually leads to some very misleading responses in their findings. And I think it's because of this. I think the key, you absolutely can have one follow the other, but I think what I found, especially with dealing with artists, that you're going to emphasize one over the other. You're going to say, this is about going somewhere from here to here, or you're going to say, I want really people to be in this space. And I find that when people they're going to emphasize one idea over the other, and I think that. But on the other hand, you're right. The two can certainly play together. But I think that it will suggest something about the degree of passivity is what I wonder a little bit. If people feel like they're being carried through something, through a story, then they're going to sit back. If they think they're being invited to walk in a place. And that's the next area I'm going to talk a little bit about, leaving empty space on purpose. And the empty space invites people to then fill in spots. So you might say, so for instance, if you're telling a story, you may say something like, I was in a really dark room, but just over my right shoulder, I could feel light streaming in. Well, I haven't told you everything. I've given you a little bit of information, and this is where Gestalt theory, if you're into this, it invites you to begin to fill this in. You're induced to fill in the rest of this world, and what you start to do is build a world along with the story. Whereas the other is, don't worry necessarily so much about the space. Think about this happens, then this happens, and the focus is on what happens as opposed to where you are. So maybe that is a little bit of the nuance. Yeah. Other questions? We're going to go to the last one. Okay. Last idea is what I call the aesthetic story. More formally, I tend to call this is aesthetic foregrounding. I was trying to think of an artistic example that you might be more popularly familiar with. And I was thinking a little bit about Cirque du Soleil. Are most of you familiar at some level with Cirque du Soleil? And what I really mean is, let's see if you can see this picture. There's this one moment in one of their shows, they have this giant tree, but there's a giant tree, and then there's musicians, and then there's jugglers, and there's people jumping all around. I'm talking about those moments where, like, there's too much going on in the show to take it all in. It's just like, and it's all this stuff. And the point, and you start to, like, imagine and look and pay attention to all the things that are going on, and you can't control everything. And in some ways, this is the point of this story. It's meant to actually disrupt the act of processing in some way. I talked to you about how people are hardwired to listen to stories. The point of this is to actually mess with that wiring and to actually send signals to people where they can't sit back. They go, wait a minute, what? They're deliberately jarred on purpose. That seems like a strange thing to do, but it's because, well, if you think about that verse from Paul, he says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's the idea is that there's an issue with the way we process. and that we can slip into bad processes. As a matter of fact, I would actually suggest most of our problems are not because we have good or bad information. It's because we don't always think well about something. We have bad habits in the way we think about things, which ultimately leaves us to see the world in a particular kind of way that's problematic. But the problem is we get used to it, and we really want to stay thinking in exactly the same way because it's easier. It's what we call cognitive fluency. It turns out that people want to quickly have shortcuts. That's why opera lovers, by the way, only want to see basically 6 operas. And if you try to program against that, they hate you because they've gotten really good at paying attention to these operas. How dare you suggest I look at something new? It's because operas aren't easy to pay attention to. They aren't, unless you get good at them. And once you get good at them, you like that you got good at it because it's much easier for you to do. Well, this is a general problem we have as human beings. We'll stick with something because it's easier to stick with it. We don't like having to not feel unsettled and messed up. But sometimes our stories need to do that. Jesus does that. I always like the story of the woman at the well. I mean, that's a truly bizarre story. She talks in a certain way. He refuses to answer the kinds of questions she's asking. It's basically saying, I don't like that question. Let's talk about something else. And he's like, it's a constant disruption. I mean, it's actually kind of uncomfortable if you thought, this isn't Jesus, and you would go, this is really awkward, this situation. But he's doing it on purpose because she is wired. The tragedy of this woman is she's been wired to think some very bad things about herself, and that's why she's trapped. Because she's learned to think about herself in a certain kind of way, and she's trapped in that. And so Jesus is deliberately messing with the way she sees and processes the world. So there's 2 ways in this kind of story you can do it. It can feature either ambiguity and or juxtaposition. So one is sometimes what we call the gaps. Some philosophers talk about the lacunae or the lacuna. It's deliberately leaving a gap. It's like, the statue that has its arm cut off? Sergei Eisenstein actually suggests that statue is actually better than a full statue. And it's because you fill in the arm. You get involved in the process. Smart artists, including great performers, leave lots of empty space in what they do. It's because you fill it in. And if you filled it in, you like it more and you're more engaged with it. Same way with your stories. If your stories are all fleshed out and no one needs to get involved in that and there's no mystery that's why people think about Murder, She Wrote. It wasn't genius. It's because people like mysteries. They like figuring things out, and you have to leave gaps in order to help people figure things out in the same way. It's about leaving stories where people go, whoa, wait a minute, what is happening right now? What is in the situation? And there's some downside to that, but it induces people to fix the problem, and that can be quite helpful. Conversely, you can go the opposite way. You can give people so much that they can't deal with it all. That can be actually quite helpful to teach you an important lesson. My favorite filmmaker is a guy named Terrence Malick. Probably his most popular film is called Thin Red Line. I don't know if you've seen that one, but Tree of Life is my favorite. Good. So I often say that with trepidation because it's pretty weird for people. I love it. You know why I love it? Because I cannot, no matter how much I've been trained, I can't contain the whole film in my head. And I hated it at first, and I went, this is fantastic. This is good for, right, I just can let things happen, and I can encounter a certain moment. I don't have to have control in this situation. This is good for me to learn. I don't have control. And what am I going to do with that? So sometimes you can tell stories, you can offer so much that people, they have to go, I have to make some choices, I have to learn to relax and not get so uptight about things. The idea here is this. It's a different kind of change. The change isn't about what you think. The change is how you think. It's teaching people to explore a different way of thinking about things. And actually, that's probably sometimes one of the best gifts you can give someone. Upside, okay, let's start with the downside. Some people just do not know. Talked about opera audiences, they just say no. And then they fire the person that keeps putting those shows on. They stop giving money. Sometimes church people do the same thing. You know that situation. Nope, I'm not doing that. So obviously you can't, there's no point. You've got to do this selectively. So you've got to understand when you're playing unfair. And part of it is, I often will say this to artists who do more abstract work. I say, you got to play more fair with these people. Don't be like, well, if they really were willing to engage. Say, just help them. Just say, walk around the room and look at this artwork from different angles. Something simple like that. And they'll go, oh, yeah. And people will actually engage if you give them a little bit of terms of engagement. But you don't have to help them figure everything out. Challenges are memorable and engaging. There's a concept that's too big to talk about right now, but flow. Maybe some of you have heard about flow before. The idea of flow is that sense of like well-being. When you are so into a project or into an activity, you have this euphoric where everything else goes away. Well, it turns out flow is a result of being really challenged to the very top of your capacity, and you win. So learning to tell stories that really challenge people, but they figure out in the end. People love that. As a matter of fact, people will like give up their entire careers and lives to search out that experience. And this is actually one of the things you should think about. If you're telling stories to certain kinds of expert listeners in your congregation or wherever you speak, if you don't challenge them with the stories, they leave, or they tune you out, or they learn to not think anymore or do something else. You've got to like push people to the edge. Last thing I want to say about this is more self equals more persuasiveness. The more you've convinced yourself effectively of something, the more you think that was really good. That's a good argument that I made to myself. So that's something for you to consider. You want people to figure things out for themselves. And again, I would suggest that is the way that the Holy Spirit and the way that God operates as well, is to walk us through stories that where we discover things because those things stick with us longer. Any questions about this specific area? Obviously, probably one of the trickier areas to deal with, but you can do stories like this. We did this, the same touring group. We would go to churches, and they would ask us to come in and do a whole service. And what we did is we would take their actual service and subvert it and do crazy things with it, and then have a sort of a little bit of a show at the end. So one of our favorite things to do was the announcement time. Someone would get up, we would have one of our cast do the announcements. They were clearly nervous, they were unprepared, and then someone would start to heckle them from the congregation. And people were really afraid at first, like, what's happening? We had one church, it was, you can tell what probably kind of church it was. They were like, do we have to cast some demons out here? I mean, it was like, we'd have to call the police. But what was great, after they recovered, it helped them rethink actually the whole idea of announcements. And that's what was great about it. It was the provocation, the upsetting of things that made them rethink the whole thing fundamentally. Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, so just some final thoughts, and we can have some question answer, some interaction. How are we doing for time? Okay. So 3 thoughts I want you to think about. One is, what style best fits my own goals? If you're storytellers, you're in a certain context, what are the change goals that you have? Number 2, what style best fits the people to whom I'm telling my story? Like I said, some of these crazier things, they are going to get you fired, so don't do that. I don't want to own that. But you can know where the areas that push the people that I speak with. Do they need new information? Do they need provocative information? Do they need maybe to follow a story, like that young woman with the prodigal son story? Lastly, what style should I work on improving or trying out for the first time? We can fall into ruts as storytellers and speakers. We like to go with what's easier as well. But again, the problem is if you speak the same way to the same people all the time, everyone learns to fall into the zone of like, let's make this really easy and not really get anything out of it. So you've got to constantly push yourself to try something, to experiment, to break out of that so you don't get into sort of this zone. Okay, let's open this up. Questions, comments, thoughts, things that you're wondering about stories, or maybe something that I haven't touched on that you want to talk about with stories. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yeah, to a certain degree. But I think that, I've talked about the idea of events and more even performance, and even we could talk about sermons as being a kind of, an event has a contract. If you think of going to a sporting event, you kind of go, this is what I'm going to do. This is why I'm going. This is how I engage. This is how they engage. And I think the testimony had a set of kind of rules. And the rules were, the speaker is supposed to be honest and self-revealing. And we talked a lot about mess was a value, actually, in our church. So authenticity was often connected to being willing to be vulnerable and to be a little bit messy and to not be prepackaged. And so people went, this is the part of the value is you get to share something that's hard for you to share, and we get to, with ourselves, think about our own mess, our own situation. And so it was it was more a situation of, it was not cathartic, because that is often a dangerous, but it was a way of seeing someone else engage in authenticity and honesty, which makes me feel better about this idea or better about my own journey. So because the highest value for the listener was the authenticity and the fact that they were moving through their lives, that's what they were looking for. And they didn't care about the entertainment value of it. The engagement was vulnerability. That was in a sense the appeal of it. You follow what I mean with that? Yeah. Great question. Any other questions or comments or thoughts or pushback is fine as well. I like that. Yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah. I would say that is not it's not terribly hard, because the epistle, in a sense, is built very much like a story. As a matter of fact, this is you might find this interesting. One of my favorite books on reading a script is called Backwards to Forwards by David Ball. Tiny little book, very amazing. And he would say, one of the best ways of analyzing a script is to start at the end and then figure out how did they get to the end and look at the events. Well, at a certain point, I started to do this with epistles. I would start with the end of the epistle. And I would go, how did they get to this end? And then I would slowly backtrack. And as I did that, I started to map out, in a sense, the story that was being told by the writer. And I started to realize, okay, this person is beginning with this idea, they're moving to and I would say, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount is one of the great stories in that sense. Not story in the sense of it as a fiction, but it's a story because Dallas Willard, by the way, does a beautiful job of explaining the story nature of this, and actually begins to build a sequence that these sequences lead to the next sequence, which leads to the next sequence. So, for instance, Willard does a beautiful job of saying, loving your enemy as yourself is a sequence that happens after a whole bunch of things that happened before this. And he pushes back at the idea that, this is an edited volume of Jesus' sayings that are mashed together. He actually says there's a sense. One of my one of my really good friends is a guy named Stephen Dempster, brilliant theologian. And one of the things that he has argued is the sequence that the Old Testament was written in the Jewish Bible is actually fundamentally important to know. That sequence is telling a story from God to the listener. And that's why he actually argues that we should return to that original order, because that sequence actually leads us beautifully into the New Testament, if we understand it. So that's why I would actually argue that the epistle is understanding, in a sense, the narrative value of what's being pushed into. And you begin to say, you see how this thing leads to this idea, and you see how this thing leads to this idea. And one image builds on top of the next image. John, for instance, if you look at the original Greek, you see that John is a poet, and he's playing with words, but he plays with them sequentially. He starts with an idea and opens it up, and then he opens it up. And so I would say this is him telling a story that he's slowly unfolding for us to take in. So I guess that's why I would say I think it is a kind of story, because it's built with that kind of structure. And if you think of it that way, you'll start to tell it in that way. Yeah. Good. Other questions or comments or thoughts you might have? What are some areas that maybe you're thinking about with storytelling? Can you talk to me a little bit about areas that you are playing with, experimenting with story, or places that you feel story has been effective for you or that you've been wondering about? I'd love to hear some of your examples. Sure, yeah, jump in. Mm-hmm. Sure. So what do you, I would say, what do you think currently prevents them from doing what you hope that for them to do? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's bring this down practically a little bit conceptually. So you feel like they don't believe that doing that is a good idea or it matters, or oh, I see. Okay. So that's two stories that they're involved in. They're involved in a story of I try and I fail. That's the story I tell myself. And there's the story of I can do something, but this isn't really a true story anyway. You're telling me a pretend story, a myth story. And so part of it is to, I think, well, one of it is to tell alternative stories, right? If someone is telling themselves one kind of story, you begin to say, let me tell you some different kinds of stories that you haven't maybe been exposed to before. For instance, I'm pacifist. One of the reasons I became a pacifist, because I didn't start that way, I sort of was led by God, is God started to tell me stories of the way that the peace of Jesus can change the world in real ways. Because I'd always heard the story of like, it's nice to be a pacifist, but really, what are you going to really do? So I had to learn a bunch of stories that I'd never heard before. Chuck Colson do you know the Body by Chuck Colson? I don't know if I love that book, and I love it because it's filled with a bunch of amazing stories that make me go, oh, that's a possibility. That could happen. So that's what I would say is one of the ways. And to have people who are deemed to be real people tell those stories, not like superheroes or superstars or people you can't connect with, real people who actually are making a difference. So that would be a way I would go into that. And again, understand that change is a slow piece. And so you've got to slowly tell stories, and sometimes it's a matter of saying a bridge story. So I've told you some alternative stories, but here's a bridge story. Here's a person who believed this story, and now they came to believe that this story might be true. Yeah, so that might be an approach to doing that. Good, thank you. Any other questions or comments or feedback? To wrap up here. Okay, well, good. Thank you very much for your time. If you want to chat more about things, I'd love to hear your feedback, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.